Hello and welcome to True Crime Daily's The Sidebar, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm currently a criminal defense lawyer based here in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for nearly a decade. We're recording this on Friday, July 15th, 2022. In this week's episode, we will be discussing a former fugitive facing murder charges after an officer who helped in his escape committed suicide. Also, additional charges piling up for a disgraced lawyer, Alex Murdoch, this time for the alleged murder of his wife and son, as well as Amber Heard's request for a new trial that has been strongly denied. Plus, we'll discuss the possible charges that the parents of the alleged Highland Park shooter could face and compare them to the charges currently faced by the parents of alleged Oxford High School shooter. Today, we are excited to be joined by Jonna Spilbor, owner and operator of Jonna Spilbor Law, a fellow prosecutor turned criminal defense attorney and legal analyst that you can see on the Fox News channel as well as other television and media outlets. Jonna, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we jump in, there's a lot to discuss today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your current practice?
Oh, sure. I kind of started like you. I did a stint as a prosecutor out in California and San Diego. That's where I began my career. But I moved back to New York, which is where I'm from. It seems like many, many moons ago, and started my own very busy practice just a little bit north of New York City, and continued to do criminal defense, divorce, and personal injury. And a lot of times, criminal defense and divorce can go hand in hand because people who are getting divorced can get a little nutty. So it's a very busy practice, and I'm enjoying it a lot.
Yeah, we get a lot of spillover from the divorce law in our practice as well. Well, we are excited to have you and excited to hear your insights, especially on these cases. So let's jump right in. We're talking about out of Lauderdale County, Alabama. Casey White, 38 years old, escaped from an Alabama jail with the help of corrections officer Vicky White, 56-year-old, and they have no relation to each other, just share the same last name. The pair eluded police for 11 days before they were apprehended in Indiana after a police pursuit that ended with Vicky and Casey crashing their vehicle. The pair was found with $29,000 cash along with multiple guns and different wigs to disguise their identities. Tragically, however, Vicky White died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and Casey White handed himself over to police. The coroner, in fact, even ruled that Vicky's death was a suicide. However, in a surprising legal move, the Lauderdale County DA alleges that while committing the crime of escape, Casey White caused the death of Vicky White. Under Alabama law, people can be charged with murder if they cause someone else's death while committing another crime. Really kind of fascinating case, Jonna. What is your initial reaction to these charges?
Okay, this is really, really interesting on a number of levels. You know, when cases like this happen, we tend to, whether you're a member of the court of public opinion or whether you're an attorney like us, you kind of take a side and you get an initial impression. Now, Casey White is not a good guy, right? He was in prison for a reason. I think his charges were fairly serious. Don't quote me. It might have been capital.
No, it was murder. It was murder charges, yeah.
So not a great guy. He obviously befriended or maybe started up a relationship with the now deceased corrections officer, Vicky White, which incidentally, sidebar, in most states, it is a crime to do that. They do not allow any sort of fostering of an inmate having any sort of relationship with a corrections officer for obvious reasons, right? We want to avoid this. And there was another notorious case here in New York, Joyce Mitchell, kind of the same thing. And one of those inmates ended up dead. However, despite the fact that he wasn't a good guy, and despite the fact that they were not supposed to have a relationship, the sort of superseding, intervening thing that happened here was that Vicky killed herself. And when we think of a felony murder, where we're all okay with the fact that if you're committing some sort of felony and somebody dies in the process, you can easily be charged and convicted of felony murder. But when you add that extra element, the suicide, which is novel historically in cases where felony murder is charged, it changes the game. At least it does for me. And I'm not at all convinced that it's going to stick, for lack of a better word, when Casey White is eventually tried for this, because it's just a different ball game. She killed herself, so there had to be some sort of intent there on her part. So it's a very novel and unique, sad, but case, and I don't know if it's going to set any precedent for future cases if anything were to happen like this again.
Yeah. You did an excellent job of kind of laying out all the issues in this. Just to give listeners kind of an understanding, we're talking about the felony murder rule, which basically says, like what you said, that if you're committing a felony, if you're committing an armed robbery, and someone dies, even if you didn't have the intent to commit that murder, they're going to charge you with murder under this felony murder concept, because you were engaged in conduct that was so likely to have the danger of death that they're going to hold you responsible and give you that kind of criminal intent. There's famous cases where a getaway driver can be charged with the armed robbery of a liquor store if the clerk gets shot, because it's the idea that going into a robbery with a gun, there's a likelihood someone could get shot. Now, what you point out here, though, is the weird thing about it is the crime that he's being accused of is murder, while the quote unquote crime that Vicky committed was actually suicide, right? So it's not that she got shot by the cops in the course of their escape, which you could maybe understand how, an escape is dangerous and running from the police, but she took this intervening step of taking her own life. And that's what I think makes it so interesting. And I agree with you. Do you see, even if he's convicted on this, what are the appellate issues you could see arising out of this?
Oh, tremendous. And can we backtrack for a second? Because you raised something very interesting, right? So setting the scene, these two are escaping, right? They're fugitives from the law. If the police had shot Vicky and she were a fleeing felon, that might have actually been okay legally. In other words, I don't know if he would have been charged because they had the right to shoot her. It would have been a justified shooting. But let's say they're fleeing from the law and they run across your lawn and you're like, oh my God, I got two felons, and you shoot her. Then of course, he could be charged with felony murder and that would likely stick. This is just so incredibly strange. So on an appellate level, let's fast forward if he were to get convicted, because look, jury's not going to like him. What's to like about this guy? He should have stayed where he was. But we have seen in the not too distant past legal issues involving people who have committed suicide and those around them being charged. Michelle Carter comes to mind. Do you remember the Michelle Carter case?
No.
Totally different set of facts, but they were two teenagers. She had a boyfriend. I think they were teenagers, maybe 19. He wanted to kill himself. He's in a car in a parking lot. Yes. And they're texting. And she got charged with manslaughter, I want to say, because she didn't stop him. And she was alleged. And
she even kind of talked him into it or something and told him this would bring him comfort or something like that, right? Yeah,
it was some crazy and, terrible tragedy. But I didn't think she was going to get convicted. She was actually just tried by a judge, not a jury. And, she ended up getting convicted and I think serving 2.5 years or something like that. So if we look at that as maybe a trend that as a society, we are not going to tolerate those who contribute to another person's suicide, then I guess we'll have to wait and see what an appellate court's going to do. But we don't like death, right? As a society, we don't like death, especially unnecessary death. But this is going to be maybe he won't even stand trial. I mean, there could be a whole slew of pretrial motions that maybe it doesn't get there. Maybe he takes a deal, which is quite, that happens quite often. Very, very, it's fascinating from a legal perspective, even though this guy doesn't have one single redeemable quality.
Right. It's almost like a law school exercise. I could see us, talking this out in Crim 101 type of a deal. And I agree with you. A jury's not going to like him. And I guess an argument could be made that, listen, this woman was living a law-abiding life. And if it wasn't for his actions, and those actions being both convincing her, however he cajoled her or, the romance or whatever it was that convinced her to take part in this, all of those actions eventually led to her death, and that he shouldn't get to walk just because her death came at her own hands. I could kind of wrap my head around that argument, and I could kind of see a jury going for it. But I cannot see, if he's convicted at trial, this doesn't end up with a fascinating a court of appeal opinion on this thing.
Yeah, that really, and maybe prosecutors will want to take it to the mat for that reason, because if you think about it, they've got nothing to lose. He was already doing life or whatever he was going to do in prison, so he's going back. And they really have nothing to lose by testing this legal theory, and perhaps for that reason they'll be encouraged to do that. That's a great point.
You might be absolutely right. They're playing with house money. They might as well see how this plays out anyways. Yeah. Well, we'll keep an eye on it. Turning now to Columbia, South Carolina, Alex Murdoch, 54 years old, stands indicted on 2 counts of murder for the deaths of his wife, Maggie Murdoch, 52, and his son, Paul Murdoch, 22. Maggie was shot with a rifle while Paul was killed with a shotgun on the family's hunting estate on June 7th, 2021. It's interesting to me, first off, the 2 different weapons were used in this killing. We'll get back to that later. But Alex called 911. He claims he found their bodies after he returned to the estate from visiting his mother and ailing father. Murdoch, formerly a respected lawyer from a notable family in which Alex's father and 2 previous generations of Murdoch men served as Hampton County's elected prosecutors for a consecutive 87 years. These are the latest in a series of charges that face Alex Murdoch, including embezzlement, conspiracy, money laundering related to distributing oxycodone, additional murder charges, and allegedly fraudulently staging his own death to collect a $10 million life insurance policy. A lot going on with Alex Murdoch. I know I'm asking you to purely speculate here, Jonna, but why do you think it took a year-long delay before bringing these charges? Okay,
I actually think this is there's a fairly straightforward reason why. And if we take Alex Murdoch's entire life, like what you just said, he comes from a legal dynasty. He was well known in the community. Obviously, this guy snapped. At some point he snapped, and the snap wasn't the murder, the alleged murder of his wife and son. The snap kind of happened before, because he allegedly was embezzling money and doing a whole lot of financially fraudulent things with his clients and his law firm. So something was going on mentally.
Drugs and everything else.
Drugs and all, and he was just unraveling emotionally. He could be suffering from some sort of mental illness. So my guess is, if I were representing him, I would have wanted him to get more than one evaluation to find out what caused him to snap. I would want him to get some treatment. I would say to the prosecutor, look, forget any sort of speedy trial issues. I'll waive them. Let's just see where he's at in his mind before you charge him. Let's see if we can work out a deal before you charge him, because this is just, like I said, maybe not insanity, not legal insanity, but something close. And I would want time to explore all of that before you charge my client. So they probably gave his defense attorney the deference. You waive time, as we say here, so that you're not under the gun to file your charges fast. And that's probably why they did it the way they did. And maybe
interesting.
In his medical records, there might be something that the defense camp is going to hang their hats on. I don't know, but like you said, I'm speculating. I don't exactly know, but I would have done it. I would have played it that way.
Interesting. So you think that maybe the defense knew this was coming for some time and said, listen, you've already got him locked up on all of these other things. We'll waive time and give you the opportunity, but give us the opportunity to do a little legwork on our own for his defense. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Initially, my thought was, sometimes when you see a delay, they're waiting on, forensic results or DNA or something like that, they're waiting to kind of dot all the I's and cross all the T's, as it were. But it makes no sense here. We're talking about a year later. It seems like all the forensics would have been put together. It is strange, and something I hope that we get to as this case continues to develop, I hope we find out more about that. Another thing I had a question about is that, again, we don't have a lot of details surrounding what the police know about these murders, but it seems to be glaringly absent from any kind of motive, right? Like, why kill your wife and kid, whatever you're involved in? And I know that motive is not something that's required for the prosecution to be proved, but do you think they need to nail that down in a case like this when you're talking about inner family murder? Why would a man kill his wife and child? Is that a question that prosecutors need to answer?
The jury's going to want to know the why. Juries always want to know the why. And when you look at the trajectory of his downfall, right, the financial crimes, and then we're taking the leap that he is responsible for the murders, and then he tried to stage his own death. And we know that there was a financial motive kind of swirling around. So did he need to kill his wife for money, for an insurance policy, and his kid is sort of got in the way? But then how do you explain the two separate weapons? Did he hire somebody to help him? I mean, I think it's not going to be a big leap for a jury to determine that he is somehow responsible for the death of his wife and son. We don't know if he was solely motivated by money because he needed it, and he maybe had planned to murder his wife, but his son was kind of, collateral damage. And wasn't his son also having legal trouble? Didn't his son cause the death of somebody on his boat? Right.
His son was facing charges for being drunk while driving a boat that ended up crashing into a bridge and killing one of the passengers in the boat. So he was when he died, he was currently dealing with those charges. And that family has since gone on to try to sue Alex again, saying that, he's responsible because he knew his son was drunk and underage that day.
Yeah, another case of, how much is the parent responsible for the acts of a child? But maybe, look, if Alex Murdoch was unraveling and he was having all these financial troubles, and then he thinks that his money is going to be at stake when those families sue his son, Paul, maybe that just contributed to it and he snapped. Although for somebody who may have snapped, and again, these are just legal theories at the moment, seems like he planned it pretty well. Usually you think of snapping where it's like heat of the moment, you catch your spouse in bed with somebody else and you kill someone. This seemed very, very premeditated. So it really is going to be interesting to learn what the defense is going to be here.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case. And to add even one more wrinkle, we already kind of touched on this, but this whole thing kind of broke because he had attempted to stage his own murder, meaning he wanted to die. He had hired someone to shoot him, but he wanted it to be done in such a way that his other son could receive his life insurance. So again, it's like this guy's all over the map because if he's responsible for the death of his wife and one son, why is he then trying to kill himself and give the money to the other son? I think you make the point, though. It might just be that there really isn't a motive here for anything because the guy is just so heavily unraveling, as you put it. The rails have so come completely off in his life that there's no rhyme or reason to anything he's doing. That just might be what we end up with.
No, exactly. Except, he is just mentally ill, and whatever brought that about. And I will say, not to toot my own horn, but when that story first broke that somebody on the side of the road and somebody tried to kill him, I said, that is that's bull. It's completely bull. And that quickly came to light that it was not the case. So his defense attorneys have a big job ahead of them because he's done some terrible things, right? To his clients, to his law firm, to his family. But I always, maybe it's me, but when somebody is suffering emotionally, you have a little sympathy, right? You got to kind of get to the bottom of that. I mean, I don't know why I always bring this case up, but years and years ago, Andrea Yates killed her 5 kids, killed them, boom, like drowned them in the bathtub, not guilty by reason of insanity. So, and especially, is there some insanity going on here that may not be legally fleshed out, but he's suffering? I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Could be a drug-fueled insanity too. Who knows? I mean, if these opiates are just so damaging to a person's psyche, who knows what this could have caused?
Horrible. accountable.
Turning now to the case that we can never escape, talking about Amber Heard's request for a new trial has been denied by the judge, and this is out of Fairfax County, Virginia. We all watched the highly publicized defamation suit. Depp sued Heard in March of 2019 for a 2018 Washington Post op-ed piece that Heard wrote about domestic violence. In June of this year, Heard was found liable for 3 defamation claims, and the jury ordered her to pay $10 million and change in damages to Depp. Fair to say, Depp was also found liable for 1 defamation claim in Heard's countersuit, and he was ordered to pay $2 million in compensatory damages. Last week, Heard's team filed a motion alleging that one of the jurors, and this was really interesting to me, I've never seen something like this, that was chosen for the trial was not the same person who received the jury summons. The person on the summons shares the same last name and first name and address as the juror who served, though the summons listed the birth year as 1945, while the birth year of the juror that served was 1970. Okay, so what happened here, obviously, is a summons gets sent to the house. It's got the name and address of 2 of the individuals that live there, and the son, I'm guessing, assumes that the summons is for him, and goes to court and answers the jury summons. And by the way, I don't think there's any evidence that anybody knew receiving these summonses what the case was for. That at least that's how it works here. You have no idea what you're going in for. Right. First of all, let me ask you, Jonna, what do you think about this filing? Like the argument behind it? Is it a good argument? Did the judge's ruling surprise you at all? What were your thoughts?
Okay, so let's start here. There are often times after a trial where the loser is going to want to file what we call post-trial motions for a variety of reasons. Now, you don't have to do it. You can opt to do it. If your client wants you to do it and they want to spend the money to do it, great. This case, I think a lot of people are trying to save face. Number one, Amber Heard.
Yeah.
Why does she want to save face? Because let's be real. Like, her career for the near future is over. Like, who is going to hire her? This was an epic trial. Her attorneys have a whole lot of egg on their face, and they're trying to maybe just get a couple of foothold back up in the grace of the legal profession.
A PR move.
Basically a PR move. Judge isn't having any of it because it's not very meritorious. On a side note, imagine getting a jury summons and like saying to your wife or your husband or your kid, like, you know what, I'm busy, you go. Like, I think that's kind of funny. But you got to remember, jurors don't just show up and sit down and then all of a sudden they're jurors. You go through a voir dire process. You painstakingly talk to these people. You compare them to the notes and the biological information you have. The judge gets to do initial questioning. So that wasn't a very meritorious claim. But can I tell you something? If Amber Heard is listening, this is what she needs to do. Because she, at this point, look at her life, right? She's got this gigantic judgment that she's probably never going to pay, or that Johnny Depp could chase her around for a really long time. She's not liked in the court of public opinion. She gave us glorious material for a variety of memes that just don't seem to really stop. They've slowed down a little. But what does she want? She wants to either A, get her life back, and B, not have a $10 million debt over her head for the rest of her life. This is what she needs to do. She needs to call Johnny Depp up and say, Johnny, I am sorry, like privately. I am sorry. I don't know. I made a lot of bad decisions. I lost my mind. I put us through this. I didn't mean to. Oh my God, help me. I've got a kid now, etc. And they can agree behind the curtain that Johnny's never going to go after this money. They can agree to that. And so she doesn't have to worry about getting chased around for millions and millions, and they can do it quietly. And that's probably what she should do, because she can't come out publicly and say, my God, I really screwed up. I lied to everybody. I lied to the court. I lied to Johnny. I lied to she'll go to jail.
Right.
She needs to just tamp it down, try to establish a relationship with Johnny Depp that gets him off her back. He probably doesn't want the money. He probably isn't planning on going after the money. But she needs to do that, and she needs to go away. And maybe in 5 years, she might get a career back. I don't know. But these motions were like a Hail Mary. They weren't going to work. The attorneys are doing what attorneys do. Sometimes their client says, do it, we do it. but it's not very meritorious.
No, I agree with you. If she's trying to rebuild her career, constantly reminding us by these new filings of the trial, and like you said, the memes all start up again, it's not doing her any favors. I was also shocked too by her behavior after. She's doubled down. I mean, it's not like she's saying, the jury has spoken, I'm going to respect their decision, blah, blah. She is trying to take up this torch of domestic violence again. And it's just, I think, just making things worse for her. Just to get back to one other little wrinkle to do with this issue with the juror. An interesting point is that the summons did not have a birth date on it. So it doesn't appear as though there's any evidence that the juror was trying to be fraudulent or trying to get onto this. It may have just been a mistake that they didn't realize who it was for, and the juror just assumed it was for him and not his father, I'm assuming. Do you think that played a role in the judge's mind? Like, if there was evidence of a juror manipulating the system in some sort of way to get on this jury, don't you think that would have carried more weight for her side of the argument?
That probably would have been a game changer. I think the intent of the mistaken juror, if it were intentional, would have played a bigger part. But as you mentioned, you don't know. You don't know what you're saying. You could be showing up for, a jaywalking case for all you know. Like, you don't know that until you're seated, number one. And number two, I don't know if there's any sort of harmless error analysis because of what we talked about a minute ago. You don't just show up, sit there, and you're a juror, right? There is a voir dire process that goes on. So however you got there, assuming that you were a resident of that county, that's really all you need to do to qualify to get to the courthouse. And then once you're in the courthouse, you have to get questioned. But also, again, sometimes I compare apples to oranges, but very recently, do you remember the juror issue in another criminal case, the Ghislaine Maxwell case? They had the juror afterwards that was said he had been sexually abused and intentionally, apparently, hid that. They had a whole motion hearing on that, and the judge was like, no, we're good. That decision I completely disagreed with. I think she should have been entitled to a mistrial. Absolutely. That's much stronger. It's a much stronger case than what the juror issue is here in the Depp Heard situation. Yeah.
And you nailed it. I think there is a huge difference, and it comes down to what was the intent of the juror. And in this case, it appears as though there's no evidence that the juror was trying to be fraudulent or play any kind of games. Whereas in the Ghislaine Maxwell, there's absolute evidence that not only were they trying to get onto this jury by hiding information, but then they used that very information to try to convince other jurors. I agree with you. I was disappointed with the judge's ruling in that case. Not that I think Ghislaine needs to walk, but it should be done the right way and not through juror misconduct. Let's jump into a subject that we've kind of alluded to a couple of times now, but we're talking about the liability of parents for the criminal actions of their children. And over the July 4th weekend, we all know about the horrible shooting that took place in Highland Park, Illinois. The prosecutor says that he expects more charges to be filed. And so everybody started to kind of speculate as to what is meant by that. We're talking about Robert Cremo III, 21 years old, faces 7 counts of first-degree murder for the July 4th Highland Park shooting that left 7 dead and dozens injured after Cremo allegedly fired over 70 rounds into the parade goers. According to prosecutors, Cremo planned the attack for weeks. The gun used in the shooting was legally purchased by Cremo, despite multiple warning signs, including incidents in which Cremo threatened family members with a knife. Another incident where officers responded after Cremo threatened to kill himself. And it should be noted that in Illinois, they do have, so-called red flag laws in effect. In spite of all of this, Cremo was able to obtain an Illinois firearm owner's ID after being sponsored by his father. And that's kind of the point we're going to talk about. Jonna, I wanted to talk about the parents' liability in that case, but I want to compare it to another case that we have been following. And this is about Jennifer and James Crumbley. They have been charged with involuntary manslaughter after their son allegedly killed 4 in the Oxford High School shooting in Michigan. Both Crumbley parents face 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Judge Matthews ruled that the Crumbley parents could stand trial adding that the parents' gross negligence allowed their son to access the murder weapon and allowed him to remain in school with that murder weapon, adding that their negligence was a substantial factor. Prosecutors alleged that there were multiple warning signs in that case and that the parents denied him mental health treatment even after he had reportedly asked for help. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. And I know that over all of this is the idea of gun control and what can be done to stop these things. But putting that aside for a moment and just kind of talking strictly about the criminal law perspective here, what kind of precedent do you think we're setting in charging parents for actions that in retrospect we expect them to have taken, or steps like in the shooting in Highland Park, steps that they took that we would expect them not to take given the mental instability of their children?
So I do think that we are kind of on the cusp of a trend where we are trying to assign criminal liability to parents for a variety of reasons, crimes that their kids commit that are big and or small. If we're going to compare these two cases, though, the Crumbly case and the Cremo case, there's one particular fact that to me is a game changer. And that is, in the Crumbly case, we're talking about a teenager, right, who committed these crimes. Your teenager is the kid who lives in your house. You tucked them in for your entire life. You sit down, you have dinner together, you check their homework, you check their social media content, you check their phones, you check their closets. That's your job as a parent.
Yeah.
But in the other case, we're talking about an adult. Now, maybe he did live with the parents. And even when the father sponsored his gun permit, and hold that aside because I want to talk about that more in a second, he still did that when Robert was 19, not technically a legal adult, not a child. So we have to be very careful. While we might be able to get behind legally the Crumbly situation and assigning criminal liability to a parent in that case, just like I would have had no problem holding the parents of the Columbine kids liable. When you have an adult living in your house who makes a horrible decision, who may be mentally ill, who may be a nut job or what have you, it might be a bridge too far, legally speaking. So I think we have to be careful of those distinguishing facts when we compare and contrast those two cases. Now, that said, if we can kind of maybe go off on a tangent for a second, imagine, if you will, like I have a gun permit. And in New York, and I represent people with gun permits who get their gun permits taken all the time. You need 4 people to vouch for you on your application. And those people have to be in your county, and they can't be members of your household. They are not allowed to be members of your household. And that makes sense to me, right? You need 4 people who are going to swear that you're not crazy and that you are okay to have a gun. So the laws obviously are a little bit different in Illinois. That said, imagine if you could assign criminal liability. If you apply, you come to New York, you apply. I'm like, yeah, you know what? Joshua's a great guy. Sure. No problem. I've never had a problem with him. Sure. I'll sign here.
Right.
If I could be responsible because you decide to kill somebody, we might as well rip up the Second Amendment, because nobody's going to vouch for another person to get a gun permit after that. So we've got to be careful of that slippery slope. In case you can't tell, I am a Second Amendment advocate. So we can't ignore that when we discuss these cases where we're trying to assign criminal liability to someone who did not pull the trigger. So that's very important to me. Yeah.
That's a really, you make really 2 really good points I hadn't really thought about. That one, there is a huge difference when we're talking about minors and in the care. We put a lot of responsibility on parents because that person is a minor, and they are seen as not being responsible for themselves to a large extent. And comparing that to a person who's a full-fledged adult. And the other point that you make, as you were speaking, I thought about that exact scenario. What if this was not somebody who lived in his home, not a relative, somebody who just signed off? And you're right. What kind of a situation are we getting into where, let's say that person goes out and commits a shooting and you had been one of the 4 that signed off for him? Are you now going to be expected to give some sort of interview to law enforcement as to why you signed off on that? And how well did you know this person? And did you know about the fact that they had attempted suicide several years before that? And did you know that they were on mental health medication and things like that? You could see the kind of hornet's nest this would open up, turning this again on its tail In this case, though, in Illinois, the father was well aware. I'm assuming, but if he's living in that household, then he's aware of the incident with the knives. He's aware of the incident where the police responded because he was suicidal. In spite of all of that, he still sponsored him, and that I think might be, if I'm the prosecutor, an element that I would push on is like, listen, the reason we want people to sign off on these sponsorships for gun permits is to act as a gatekeeper. Do you understand the mental health of this person in a way that the law enforcement or others might not? Let us know if he's safe or not, and that is there a responsibility in signing that? I mean, I'm just kind of talking free flow here, but what are your thoughts on that? Like, at some point, isn't there a responsibility? I imagine that when you're signing off on these things, you're attesting to the fact that this person is not a threat, right?
Well, and that's the idea. Right. But look at the trust factor there. I mean, the points you're making are excellent. I could talk about this with you for hours and hours, because here's what is sticking in my craw. First of all, when the father vouched, the defendant here was 19. How many years later? So 2 years later, he commits these horrible crimes. OK, so there's this huge gap of time. Right. Second, just like in New York, that is one of the reasons why you can't have a family member or a household member sign off on your gun permit application, because, it reminds me of, there was an old show when I was a kid called Welcome Back, Kotter. And every time Epstein did something wrong, he'd send a note to school and it was signed by Epstein's mother, right? If your mother or father can't say something good about you, nobody can. So it's kind of a dumb rule that Illinois has. But let's not forget one other thing. When you fill out this application, I'm sure when Cremo filled out this application, it goes to the sheriff's department. There, it probably goes to the sheriff's department or another police agency. They are responsible for vetting you. Like, they now have a job to do. You don't just rubber stamp those things. You have to do a whole criminal background check. You've got to check those references. You've got to do your due diligence before you give somebody license to kill. Yeah. So let's not ignore the police responsibility here. Yeah. And so that's another differentiating factor that we've got to analyze.
Yeah, no, you bring up a point that I was going to ask you about. In fact, let's say they do end up charging the father in that case in Illinois. Why can't the same argument be extended to the police? If they have responded of 2 times that we know of where he exhibited violence, either towards himself or towards family members, why aren't at what point do the police have a responsibility, or the state or the city or whoever you're saying is supposed to be in charge of vetting? And like I said, they have these red flag laws in Illinois. Why aren't these being enforced? And if you're going to extend liability to the father, why doesn't it extend also to law enforcement and to the state? I don't know the answer. I don't know if it should extend. I don't know if it shouldn't. There was a lot that broke down here, but it's raising some really interesting questions about liability and how far should it go. If we could go back to the Crumbly situation just briefly, because I wanted you to help explain this to listeners. They're being charged with involuntary manslaughter, right? So the idea is, the intent is less, right? There's no premeditation. There's no intent to kill, but the judge highlighted this concept of gross negligence. Could you kind of walk listeners through that to understand why they're being charged with the crime that they're being charged with?
Okay. So when it comes to when people are killed, when a homicide is committed, right? Somebody's killed by another person. There are levels of intent that are required when you're making the charging decision. So obviously, while Crumbly, the child, can be charged with murdering people because he had the intent to go and kill. When you don't have a specific intent to kill, but you act in such a way that is so reckless that it just exhibits a complete disregard for human life. A more common example is when you get behind a wheel drunk and you mow down a couple people in a crosswalk. Typically you're going to be charged with a negligent homicide or an involuntary manslaughter. You didn't get in the car and say, I'm going to kill this person. You got in the car in such an irresponsible way that you ended up causing the death of another. So there are taking that legal construct and assigning it to the parents in the Crumbly case to say, well, wait a minute, you were so reckless in that you didn't keep deadly weapons away from your son who had exhibited bizarre behavior that you should have seen as the people who tuck him in at night as dangerous, potentially dangerous. And because you basically, it would be the same as if your kid comes home drunk and you hand him the keys of the car and say, go get me a quart of milk from the store. Legally speaking, the responsibility is the same. The facts are different. The responsibility is the same. And that's why the parents are being charged, not with murder, not like they were an accessory in that regard, but with the reckless conduct resulting in the unintentional death on their behalf of the people who were killed by their son.
Yeah, no, excellent job of laying that out. And it really, the analogy you give really helps people to understand how they're placing that intent and mindset on these parents who were nowhere near where the shooting took place. Yeah. I think that was really it. I think that was the turning point in this case too, is it wasn't so much that the parents should have done a better job of addressing his mental health. They should have, but it wasn't that. It wasn't the fact that they kept him in school, though he was exhibiting these kind of, unhealthy and violent attitudes. It was the buying the gun. Right? It was in spite of all of that, maybe there were other steps you could have taken at parents, but now you just, like you said, handed the keys to a drunk person. So you handed this deadly weapon to a person who is exhibiting these types of traits. And that's where we're holding you responsible. I'll give you the last word on this. Where do you think this is a precedent that needs to be set, or do you see ramifications that are unintended that could be disastrous for how parents treat their own children after this?
That's such a great question, because we are having this discussion on the heels of yet another school shooting. And every time a child is killed by a gun in school, my heart, and I don't have any kids, but I cry real tears. It's heartbreaking, and we want it to be avoided. And whenever a child is killed by another child in a way that was avoidable, you can't help but look at the parents. And if we can't get parental attention simply by saying, please take care of your kids and make sure that they grow up to be law-abiding citizens and productive members of society, if we can't get their attention that way, then charging parents with the crimes of their children may actually send a message that will resonate as we move forward into the future. Because I can tell you this, the answer isn't take away all guns. That's not the answer. We're focusing on the issue of parental responsibility for the children you spawned. You know them better than anyone else. You know them better than their teachers. You know them better than their friends. You know them better than anyone else. And there is a responsibility. Parenthood is a great responsibility. It can't be shirked. And so, this is something that I think parents should want to perk up. They should want to perk up and do an analysis. Check on your kids. No parent wants their child to go to prison at age 17 for the rest of their lives. What parent wants that? So it's a wake-up call. It's a societal wake-up call. And, and people like us, to the extent that we can help, then I think we also have a responsibility to help the people who need to help their kids. So that's my word on that. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. It's we can't keep having these tragedies, but we can't also solve them with just these kind of monolithic approaches, that there's so many nuanced things that need to be addressed. And one of them is that responsibility and the health of children, or of parents with their children, right? That there has to be some sort of responsibility there to check in on them and make sure that they're healthy and not going to be the type of person to go out and do something horrible like this.
Again, like I said, I don't have children, but the phrase that I heard most often growing up in my household, when I did something that was even remotely wrong, and of course they were minor offenses, my father would say, "You're grounded till the leaves come on the trees." And that would be like sometime in November. And he kept his word. I spent a lot of time grounded till the leaves came on the trees, whatever it took. So it's not an easy job being a parent. I know, only because I was a kid of very strict parents. But thank you very much for having. This was a great discussion. Like,
and like you said, I could talk to you about this for hours. But thank you so much for coming on this week. Where can people find out more about you?
Oh, that is easy. You can always visit my website. That's jonnaspilborlaw.com. You can find me all over social media. My favorite is Facebook. I'm there at Jonna Spilbor and Jonna Spilbor Law. I'm also all over Instagram. I like to do some silly things too, because look, we have very serious jobs, and every once in a while you have to let your hair down a little bit. So yes, I'm all over social media. You can sometimes see me on Fox and Law and Crime and stations like this. So this is always a fun opportunity, and I really appreciate having this intellectual conversation with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And you can find our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And we want to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCD Sidebar. And thank you for joining us at the True Crime Daily Sidebar.